Hey, what's up everybody? In this video, I will show you how I removed and disassembled the rear shocks and springs on my Acura TSX. With the car on the ground, I started by gaining access to the top of the rear shocks through the back seat. Use a 10mm socket with an extension to reach a bolt near the driver's side seatbelt buckle. Yours may already be removed. Remove the bolt. The lower front edge of the rear seat cushion has metal hooks that lock into a socket. Lift up to unfasten it. There's one on each side. Now you can lift the whole cushion out of the car. The seat side bolsters have a 10mm bolt at the bottom. Remove it. Bring down the rear seat backs one at a time. Lift up on the seat side bolsters to remove them. You can't just pull them towards you because they're hooked into some holes. You can see the top of the shocks from here. There are some plastic clips that are holding in the rear shelf. To gain more space to the top of the shocks, lift up on the rear shelf. It's time to jack up the rear of the car. My car is parked on a slight incline, so I chalk the front wheels to prevent the car from rolling back when I jack it up. You're going to jack up the rear from the rear tow hook. Set your jack stands under the pinch welds and remove the wheels. The sway bar end links are attached to the knuckle by a bolt. Remove the bolt. For the OEM links, you're going to have to use a hex wrench and a combination wrench. I have Moog links, so I use an 18mm combination wrench and a socket wrench. Remove the nut and pull the end link off. Then move the end link towards the rear of the car. The lower part of the shock is held by a large bolt. The head of the bolt faces the rear of the car. On the other side, the bolt threads into a nut that's welded onto the bracket. Use a 17mm socket to remove it. If the bolt is stuck, spin it out with your impact wrench. The bottom of the shock is wedged into grooves. It can only move up and away from you. So here's the plan. Insert a large pry bar over the rear arm and under the frame. Pry down on the arm and the suspension will lower. The shock will come out of the grooves. Then push the shock away from you to clear the bracket. At the top of the shock, use a 14mm socket to loosen the top nuts on the shock. But don't remove the nuts just yet. Next, with one hand, hold the shock and lift it up. Then use your other hand to remove the top nuts off the top of the shock completely. Guide the shock straight down. Let it rest if you want to, but don't let it go unless it's secured. To get the shock out of the wheel well, you're going to have to lower the bottom of the shock under the subframe. Then tilt the top of the shock towards you. The top of the shock should now be able to clear the wheel well. Let's take a look at this old shock. It has oil residue on the shaft, oil mixed with dirt on the top of the shock tube, and dirt and oil on the bottom of the bump stop. These are signs that the oil was leaking out of the shock. These are Coney Sport shocks with about 100,000 miles. They're 10 years old. Now let's disassemble the shock. I use my spring compressor clamps to compress the springs. Make sure you buy some with the safety tabs. You'll see me use the clamps with the bolt heads facing towards the bottom of the shock. But I realized later it's easier if you face the bolt heads up. Tighten your clamps and keep them opposite each other. Now compress the clamps with an impact wrench, compressing one side at a time. You can stop when the shock moves freely from the spring. Now let's take it all apart. Remove the top nuts. My shock has 2 of them. Remove the top washer. Remove the mounting base with the rubber cushions. Remove the lower washer. Now you can separate the shock from the spring. Remove the bump stop. Remove the dust cover lower mount. It has some damage, but I will reuse it because I forgot to order new ones. Let's use the OEM manual diagram to help reassemble the shock. My new shocks are KYB shocks. Insert the dust cover lower mount. Insert the dust cover. I'm improvising here. I'm using one of the off-roading dust covers that I found on Amazon. Insert the bump stop. Carefully insert the spring and ensure the bottom of the spring sits completely down. Now let's assemble the damper mounting plate with the rubber bushings. Align the circles of the rubber cushion with the circles on the metal mounting plate. The side of the rubber cushion also has slots that you need to align. Next, insert the collar partially into one bushing. Then insert the bushing with collar in the mounting plate. Now press in the other bushing into the collar. This can be a little bit tricky. Use water and soap to help squeeze the 2 bushings on the collar. The OEM manual shows something called the bump stop plate. Here's the OEM part, and it fits neatly on the top of the bump stop. The manual also shows something called the dust cover plate, which is basically the lower washer. So here's the bump stop plate and lower washer. Then the mounting plate. Ensure that the spring is secured under the mounting plate. Next, add the top washer and finally add the top nut. On these KYB shocks, you need to use 2 wrenches to tighten the top nut. The manual says to tighten up to 22 foot-pounds. And I did 20 foot-pounds because it bottoms out at that point. I used my crow's foot wrench with an extension and my 3/8 torque wrench. So here's what it looks like torqued to 20 foot-pounds. Before you uncompress the spring, you have to line up the top mounting bolts parallel to the lower bolt holes. If you don't align this, the shock will not fit back into its place on the car. You can use silicone spray under the mount plate cushion to help it move and ensure everything is aligned. Let's go over some reinstallation tips. It's the reverse to get the shock into the wheel well. Tilt the shock at an angle and then insert the bottom of the shock under the subframe. Now lift the top of the shock into the wheel well. Lift the top of the shock to the mounting holes on the car and hold the shock up with your hand while you screw in the mounting nuts at the top. Remember, the bottom of the shock needs to fit into the grooves. Use the pry bar to lower the knuckle and then pull the shock towards you and over the grooves and let the knuckle rise by releasing the pry bar. Insert the large bolt to the lower part of the shock. Use a socket wrench to help thread it in, but don't fully tighten it yet. Then connect the end link, but don't fully tighten it yet. Now use your floor jack to lift that suspension knuckle. Now you can torque the lower damper bolt to 80 foot-pounds and the end link nut to 30 foot-pounds. And you can also torque the shock's top 2 mounting nuts to 37 foot-pounds. Now you can lower the suspension with the floor jack. When you're putting the side bolster back, make sure to pull the seatbelt so it doesn't get stuck under it. Snap back in those clips on the rear shelf too. The center seatbelt buckle has the words center on it. Don't mix it up with the passenger side rear buckle. Make sure that the rear seat cushion is fastened as you put it back. Listen for the click. Let's compare the new shock versus the old shocks. Compression should be smooth and consistent going up and down. That's all, folks. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below in the comments. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.